Let me now introduce Nicole Keenan, the report author and a researcher here at Puget Sound, to begin the briefing.
Thank you. Great. So over the past year, there have been increased complaints by workers at Sea Tac Airport about working conditions. But in particular, we wanted to highlight how fuelers threatened to strike over safety on the tarmac. And in late November, workers filed allegations of labor, health, and safety violations with the state labor and industries. Some of these allegations are so egregious that Labor and Industries actually just opened up a review of Alaska Airlines itself as the company that contracts out to Menzies, DGS, and a number of other contractors that we'll talk about later. So these problems are not the same everywhere. It turns out major West Coast airports have chosen a beneficial course, while Sea Tac's harmful choices have been flying below the radar. During this briefing, I will cover 3 areas. First, I will talk about current working conditions and the consequences for workers, travelers, and the local economy. Second, I will discuss what other airports have done to address these problems and how they are benefiting from these investments. And finally, I will wrap up with recommendations of how Sea Tac Airport and its dominant carrier, Alaska Airlines, can rise to the West Coast standard and land a better future for workers, passengers, and our region's economy. Our report focuses primarily on a group of over 2,000 workers at Sea Tac Airport that provide critical ground services. We chose to look at them for 2 main reasons. First, the allegations of labor violations and poor safety conditions come from these workers. And second, these jobs are impacted by the industry-wide trend towards outsourcing. Ground handlers provide ramp, in-cabin, and passenger services, as you can see on this slide. In-cabin service workers are responsible for restocking, cleaning the cabin, disinfecting bathrooms and seat trays, and checking the cabin for bombs and safety hazards. Passenger services typically occur inside the terminal and include check-in staff, sky caps, and wheelchair assistants. And finally, we have ramp workers. And ramp workers' responsibilities include guarding the tarmac, moving and sorting passenger bags, fueling the plane, and removing ice to ensure the plane is safe to fly. So let me give you an example of how outsourcing has worked. At Sea Tac 8 years ago, most ramp workers worked directly for airlines. Alaska employed most of them with nearly 500 ramp workers. In 2005, as a cost-cutting measure, Alaska laid off these employees and told them they could reapply for their jobs with significant pay cuts with the new contractor Menzies. Now, shifts like this have happened across the airline industry. Thousands of jobs that used to operate in-house were shifted to low-cost contractors. But now let's discuss what we found in our report. We focused our analysis on 5 major airports on the West Coast: San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Los Angeles, and Sea Tac. We studied workforce policies for ground-based operations at all of these airports. And this chart provides a snapshot of what we found. For those of you who are only on audio, it's on the chart on page 2 of the report. The higher wages and benefits at the other West Coast airports are aimed at reducing worker turnover, improving quality of service, strengthening the local economy, and stabilizing the workforce. We'll come back to this chart in a minute, but first let's look at what operating below standards means for Sea Tac Airport and its hub and its major airline, Alaska. By operating below standard, Sea Tac Airport has chosen a course that is harming workers, airlines, and our region's economy. Substandard working conditions can have serious consequences for travelers' safety and security. In late November, over 50 workers filed formal allegations with Washington State's Labor and Industries. These complaints are still under review, and like we mentioned earlier, Alaska Airlines has also been roped into this review. We were able to get a hold of these complaints and found that across the board, workers complained about improper equipment and poor training. For example, cabin cleaners filed complaints about exposure to extremely toxic disinfectants in cramped spaces without proper protection. They are also responsible for looking for suspicious items on the plane, but most have never been trained on what to do in an emergency. Another example is wheelchair attendants who felt that they had little to no training on how to safely move passengers with disabilities. I'm reading this quote aloud from a wheelchair attendant that was in one of the formal complaints, if any people are only on the phone and can't see the PowerPoint. If a passenger was to relieve him or herself in my chair, I would just take it to the restroom and clean it with napkins and soap, and then continue to use my chair. Management has never told me what to do with that chair. I have no gloves or spray to use, so I would clean it with my hands in the restroom. We compared these allegations with findings of hundreds of worker surveys conducted at LAX and San Jose, and found that, like Sea Tac, there had been minimal investment in training and security at these airports before they implemented their new workforce standards. Now, before the tragic events of 9/11, airlines were responsible for security screening, just like they're responsible for baggage handling or passenger services today. The wages were so low and the turnover so high that the Federal Government Accountability Office issued a study that found that low wages and high turnover were direct causes of compromised security at airports. 9/11 focused the public eye on security at airports, and in 2002, the federal government stepped in and took security screening away from airlines and formed the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA. Despite the efforts from TSA, there's still quite a bit of concern about security at airports. And this makes sense since security screeners are not the only workers with security roles at airports. As we've mentioned, ground handlers have significant security roles. In contrast to Alaska Airlines, Southwest Airlines has kept all of their ground handling in-house and ensures they have comprehensive safety and security training. They do this to ensure profitability and customer loyalty. I'll read another quote in case you can't see the slide. So Ann Naylor, Senior Director of Ground Operations at Southwest Airlines, stated, "Other airlines are playing a dangerous game with their customers. Although they may save on ground handling fees and maximize profit in the short term, they are damaging the relationships of trust with the passenger. Such an approach is far less likely to lead to loyal customers." Now that we have looked at negative consequences for safety and security for travelers, let's look at the negative consequences for the workers themselves. Most ground handlers at Sea Tac make half of what the average worker at Sea Tac makes, and 50% below a living wage for a single adult in Washington state. Low wages also impact the local economy. According to a survey of nearly 1,000 airline workers, over 50% of airline contract workers live around Sea Tac, including Des Moines, Burien, Tukwila, White Center, Kent, and Federal Way. This is on page 12 of the report. These cities experience higher rates of poverty compared with the rest of King County. To be clear, we're not saying low-wage jobs cause poverty, but these jobs have the potential to strengthen the local economy and reduce poverty for a large workforce in the region. Additionally, substandard working conditions and poverty also impact public health. The neighborhoods where many airline contractors live also face poor health indicators, in addition to poverty. And you can find this on page 13 of the report. These workers, their families, and many people in their communities cannot afford to go to a doctor if they are sick, and report being in poor health at much higher rates than the rest of King County. These workers are not guaranteed paid sick days, which also puts travelers and other airport workers at risk. Airports are well known as one of the places people get sick, from a common cold to a more infectious disease like SARS or H1N1. Many workers lack paid sick days and thus have a lot of incentive to go to work sick, even if they're seriously ill. With earnings just above the federal poverty threshold, workers who lose a day's pay to stay home can miss a bill payment or even rent. For some companies at Sea Tac, workers are penalized for taking a sick day. For example, Menzies workers report that even if you call in sick with a doctor's note, you can receive a demerit towards losing your job. Now that I've explored Sea Tac's low-wage jobs and substandard working conditions and the harmful consequences, I'd like to focus on what choices other airports have made to make things better. As we noted earlier, 4 major airports on the West Coast implemented workforce standards to benefit passengers, the local economy, and workers. These airports protected public health by implementing paid sick days and health insurance incentives.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Maximize employer investment and time in training. Since cabin cleaners, ramp workers, and passenger service workers also have safety and security responsibilities, Airports want to make sure that all of these work
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
in the surrounding communities and more money that can be spent at local businesses and grocery stores. And finally, workforce standards help workers by lifting thousands of people and their families out of poverty. So let's look at which policies they implemented. So this chart compares 4 major West Coast airports with Sea Tac on a series of workforce standards, which I will define now. First, we have living wages or minimum compensation. And you can also find this chart on page 19 of the report. So back to living wages. First, we have living wages or minimum compensation. Living wage policies require that airport businesses provide a higher minimum compensation for workers. As you can see here, Sea Tac Airport falls far below other airports on the West Coast. Then there are health benefit incentives. Each airport does this a little differently, but for the most part, it means that the employer can pay a slightly lower wage if they offer health insurance. And then we have worker retention. Worker retention requires that an airline replacing one contractor with another must retain the current workforce for a certain period of time, such as 60 to 90 days. And then there's paid time off, and at San Francisco, Oakland, and LA, employers must provide paid sick days. Then we have collective bargaining agreement provisions. And these provisions allowed existing agreements between unions and businesses at the airport to remain intact as long as they stay true to the intent of workforce standards. For example, some collective bargaining agreements at LAX also require employers to provide uniforms for their workforce. Finally, we have training programs. 2 airports, SFO and San Jose, require minimum safety trainings based on job function. For example, in San Francisco, workers with security or safety functions are required to have a minimum of 40 hours of safety and security training. So all 4 airports implemented workforce standards to curb the negative impacts of outsourcing. But let's look into how and why each airport implemented these standards. So San Francisco faced high turnover with security screeners near the year 2000. The airport director and San Francisco's Board of Supervisors saw the risk of this situation for security at the airport and implemented the Quality Standards Program to cover all workers with any security function. This included more than just security screeners, but also cabin cleaners and ramp workers. Within a couple years of implementing their workforce standards, the University of California, Berkeley conducted a study on the impact of the Quality Standards Program. It is the most comprehensive study on the outcomes of workforce standards at airports. And they found the program had been successful in reducing turnover by up to 60% for sectors with the lowest wages, increasing employee satisfaction and employer satisfaction. Employers reported improvements in morale, decreases in grievances, decreases in employee disciplinary issues, and decreases in absenteeism. In addition, to go back to the turnover point, businesses at San Francisco saved $6.6 million annually in reduced turnover costs. The second airport we studied is LAX. Although LAX was concerned with safety and security, they also had another reason for implementing workforce standards: public health. Busy airports are known as potential super spreaders of infectious disease. With 51 million travelers passing through LAX annually, and shortly after the spread of H1N1 and SARS, City Council members were very concerned with the public cost of caring for uninsured workers and the potential harm to public health if sick workers have incentive to go to work sick. The City of LA estimated that public health services and insurance for LAX workers cost the state $3.9 million per year. To address these concerns, LA City Council passed policies to implement workforce standards to cover airport workers. As a result of workforce standards, thousands of workers and their families got access to health care. The third airport we cover is Oakland. Here, instead of policymakers implementing workforce standards, the voters did it. Oakland voters passed a ballot measure for an airport living wage and workforce standards, with 78% of voters supporting it. And then finally, we have San Jose. The City of San Jose passed workforce standards for their airport in 2008 with the support of their dominant airline, Southwest. The policy passed fairly quickly because Southwest got behind it, understanding that this policy would benefit their company. Southwest Airlines CEO Gary Kelly was quoted as saying, "I want to thank you and the entire San Jose community for creating an environment where Southwest Airlines has been able to grow and prosper." So while Southwest, Alaska, and other airlines operate at the standard at other West Coast airports and are reaping the benefits, they have yet to do so here. Like Oakland, Sea Tac is governed by a port, and like most of the airports on the West Coast, Sea Tac has a dominant airline. For us, it's Alaska. Alaska consists of Horizon and Alaska and nearly has 50% of the market share at Sea Tac, and as such has significant sway on airport operations. Alaska Airlines is one of the most financially stable airlines in the industry, and Sea Tac is their hub. We analyzed Alaska Airlines and their contractors' operations at these 4 other airports with workforce standards and found that Alaska has grown and invested more time and resources at these airports since they implemented workforce standards. For example, Alaska increased operations at San Jose from 8 to 13% of market share after San Jose implemented workforce standards. This added up to a 26% increase in annual enplanements. They also invested $16 million in a new terminal at LAX after LAX implemented their living wage. And they're in a position to be a leader as Southwest was in San Jose. But let's also look at the contractors of Alaska. So we have Menzies, which does baggage handling, ABM, ASIG, and DGS, who all provide vital services for Alaska Airlines at Sea Tac. These 4 contractors have already adjusted to the West Coast standard at other airports, in addition to adjusting to operations on a global level. Several of these companies have more than 7,000 employees internationally and have adjusted to a variety of standards around the world. After reviewing workforce standards implemented across the West Coast, we found that there are substantial consequences and possible benefits. Public officials charged with the health and welfare of King County residents should work together to enact policy and programs that align with the standards set by other West Coast airports. Alaska Airlines can and should lead this transformation. Specific policies and programs should include living wage policies, paid time off, worker retention, and training standards. In conclusion, other airports on the West Coast are up to standard, and communities and businesses and airlines are thriving, and we can do the same. This concludes our presentation.